Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you a quick update on what is going on with strike negotiations in Minneapolis Public Schools. Heather, we're in day 10 of the strike. How are you doing?
It's challenging, right? This is the same amount of days kids just recently missed for online learning. Um, and so, yeah, just this is 10 days of no school, week 3 of disruption. It's been a lot.
It's definitely been a lot. But it seems like the sides are getting closer, and there's huge news on the teacher of color front. So let's start there. We are super excited and very happy to hear that both Minneapolis Public Schools and the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers have put together an MOA that is publicly on the table, or it's not even an MOA, contract language that is on the table to protect teachers of color from being cut from their buildings through excessing and being cut from the district through layoffs. So Heather, do you want to talk a little bit about, just your reactions to that as a parent? And we can also talk a little bit about the language differences that still exist. But again, both sides have language on the table, and there are just a few final details to iron out before that language is in contract. But Heather, go ahead.
I mean, I think it feels hopeful, right? That our district at some point could be able to offer students of color an experience that is more reflective. I think it's also a shift in what we would call like a policy that reads as race neutral, but because of the circumstances that lead up to it, it's not race neutral. It has really racist effects. And so it has been a big lift. And we have some amazing caregivers, parents, and advocates that have worked tirelessly, and school board members that have really held to this value throughout a lot of tension, and some teachers who have also like really worked to make sure people understand. So it is an incredible thing to see this in contract language. It'll be bigger and a more amazing when it's signed.
Right.
But this is a big day.
Right. No, definitely. Everyone needs to have their fingers crossed, and make sure that this language stays in place until a deal is signed or through a deal being signed. But exactly, there are so many important voices, and especially as the strike continued on, to hear and see teachers really rally around us. Teachers of color speaking their truth and owning their truth publicly in the middle of the strike, and really defining what solidarity meant to them. To see white teachers really lean into that, like, I thought that was a very important moment throughout these last 14 days around the strike, around what making this possible and making both sides really recognize and demonstrate to how it is a priority to our systems, to our institutions, and to our community. So I wanted to just highlight really quickly the language that has been shared so far. And so this is the language MFT has put forward around layoffs, and really trying to provide protections from layoffs. And again, this is really strong language that we know has held up to some legal challenges, and using the language of underrepresented. So in the highlighted language that you can see here, it says teachers who are members of populations underrepresented amongst licensed educators or licensed teachers in the district, if placing the teacher on layoff would prevent students from having access to teachers who are members of populations underrepresented among licensed teachers in the site over the next least senior teacher who does not qualify for the above exemption. That is a bunch of policy wonk gobbledygook, but what that basically means is that this contract will lay out protections and exemptions for teachers of color so that they will not need to be laid off, which is huge news. So this is the layoff section, right? Again, using that term underrepresented is important because it doesn't make a decision based on race. It makes a decision based on underrepresentation. And we know that there are several groups that are underrepresented in comparison to our student population. But it is significant that that language is in there. And it is significant also in the language at the top that it says teachers working in the following programs may be exempted. And so we'll get to that in a second. But this is like ideal language. And so huge shout out to the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, the whole union leadership for getting that language up there, because this is important. And I think it is language that hopefully can make a real significant change, like you were saying, Heather, within our system. But I did also really quickly want to point out the accessing language in the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers proposal. And so the accessing language is also very good. I really do want to say I'm so happy and encouraged to see the language that has been put out there. I would make 2 tweaks to this language for it to be perfect. And it is language that Minneapolis Public Schools has included in their proposal. And so the first one is starting with the spring 2023 budget tie-out cycle. So we know that this past March in spring of 2022, that was the end of the March budget, or that was the end of the 2022 budget cycle, or budget tie-out cycle, I should say. But we know with some of the changes that have been happening to the budget because of these negotiations, schools are going to need to resubmit new budgets based on these changes. And so we believe that it is important that this language actually says the spring 2022 budget tie-out cycle, so that teachers of color who are accessed already, and any teachers of color that might be accessed in this new process, are protected from that accessing. Because again, we know how disruptive accessing and being cut from the building is to both a school and to a teacher and to those students. And so it is really important that we make sure that we don't take opportunities for students to have access to teachers of color who we know are so important to the academic, social, and emotional growth of a student. We have to make sure that we take advantage of the opportunity in front of us to also protect those teachers currently. So that is one point that I would just like to point out around language that could be improved in this accessing language. And then another point I would also add is kind of in the last section here, it says the district shall retain the teacher over the next least senior teacher. Again, this is a little bit technical, so I don't need to get too far into it, but I know folks see that as like really strong affirmative language. And actually you need that language to be a little bit flexible, because again, if the intended goal is to protect our teachers of color, saying the district shall retain that teacher means that it can open you up to protecting lots of different groups of underrepresented folks, right? Again, we know that men are underrepresented in comparison to the student population. And so we could end up protecting a lot of white men in the profession as opposed to teachers of color. And so again, it is really important that actually the district has some level of flexibility to be able to target this towards the teachers that we say we want to target, with all of the organizing and all of the effort that has been put in to making sure that this district is anti-racist in its policies and in its practices.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So again, huge celebration and shout out to Minneapolis Public Schools and the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers for getting there with this language. And now it's just about meeting in the middle, finding those tweaks, maximizing our opportunities to save teachers of color, protect teachers of color, and also making sure it is targeted towards the populations that we actually want to ensure are protected. But Heather, let's talk a little bit more about the rest of the negotiations around the strike.
Yeah, I think the other conversation that we need to start to talk about is like this kind of concept of trade-off, right? So we know that in the last few days, the federal and state governments have not granted Minneapolis Public Schools more budgetary dollars. We know that the cross subsidy for special education still exists. We know that the cross subsidy for English language learners still exists. So we know now that with increasing of pay, which by the way, I don't think anybody argues that we want that to happen. The question is, there will be trade-offs when it happens. We know that with the latest proposal that came forward for raising ESP pay does include $10 million worth of cuts in other areas, right? I'm not going to offer an opinion on any part of that, but we do have to be really honest about the fact that there are going to be some trade-offs that are going to come out of this cycle, whether, and maybe those trade-offs are things we want, but it does seem like something that we need to be really honest to and talk about as a city.
Right. And so, I've seen lots of discourse and conversations happen publicly around, let's take it from Davis Center, like Davis Center is very top heavy, or let's take it from all these places. Like the fact is $10 million is a lot of money. And again, like you said, maybe it is a trade-off that we're willing to make in order to appropriately pay our ESPs, because no one wants to exploit our ESPs. No one wants to exploit our teachers for working at lower wages because that's what we can afford, right? The challenge is like, what comes of moving money to pay these positions? What comes of that? Like, where does that money come from? Does it come from us having less ESPs or less teachers? Does it come from cutting community engagement? Does it come from cutting our interpreter services? Does it come from cutting our communications? And I can guarantee you, I've heard enough from parents to say they cannot cut any more from communications at this point. But like that, those are the trade-offs that like this district, this system has to make, unless Governor Walz decides to pour in more money into Minneapolis public schools. We also know that Republicans in the Senate are not willing to give Minneapolis public schools more money at this point. And so what is the answer? I don't know. And I think that's been the really hard part, especially for our coalition members, to figure out how can we say like, this is what should happen financially, or this what isn't what should be happening financially, because we didn't know, and we still don't know, where is that money going to come from and what's the trade-off. If it was really clear where that money could have came from, it would have been easier to weigh in. But at this point, it's still really difficult to say like, yes, this should happen. What I can stand and say and can feel very strongly is like, everybody should be making a livable wage. And so I fully support that. But again, is that going to come at the cost of cutting ESPs? Is that going to come at the cost of cutting the amount of teachers that we have? And those are really, really hard conversations. And it looks like the ESPs and the teachers have had that conversation, because the teachers, their initial ask was for a 20% increase. They have now just announced that they are down to a 5% increase in year one and a 4% increase for year two. So that is huge movement by the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers to make this financial deal work. Now the question is that still going to lead us to a place where we're going to have to make significant cuts in other areas? And we'll have to see, and they'll have to come to a final agreement, because they still haven't come to a final agreement with Minneapolis Public Schools. And yeah, it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I think the finiteness of our system, we've dealt with this problem before, right? And I think the other thing that we have to start to talk about is the impact, right? So like there's as the strike goes longer, right? The conversation about extending the school year, about kiddos coming in dysregulated, about all of these things become much more real. And we still have to start to ask, like, we will probably have to reschedule graduations. We might have to, maybe we won't have spring break. But I think we have to make up days. And I think those, the impact of the students of our city, and look, change is always disruptive. You don't get change without disruption. And so I feel, I just think it's part of what we have to name. That families are really struggling right now. I know it's tough. And I talked to parents every day last week who were really struggling financially, emotionally. Their children are not doing well. This is hard.
Right. And I think the thing is that our students, again, in Minneapolis Public Schools, I've said it before, I'll say it again, our students deserve the world. Now it's up to us to figure out what we can, with the resources that we have, what can we prioritize to make sure that we give them as close as we can to what they deserve. And again, that means trade-offs. And so when you are living in a world of finite resources, because that's the world we live in, like where does the money come from? And that's where the negotiations currently stand, right? Is like that is we're looking at how do we afford class size caps? How do we afford increases in pay? How do we afford caseloads? And those are important things to figure out, because that means attention, that means capacity that goes towards a limited amount of students, which we want. And at the same time, how do we how do we pay for that? We know that our senior officer of finance, Ibrahima Giap, has been telling us for years that the budget is structurally broken.
Yes.
He's been telling the board that for years. And
Yes.
this strike, these 10 days out of school, is the epitome of that, right?
That's right.
It isn't the warning anymore. It is the fruition of a structurally broken budget where we do not have the revenue anymore to not only like support the amount of staff that we have, but then to also pay them what they need and deserve, right? And that is the hard part of this conversation, is that for years and years and years, the board has deferred layoff decisions, has deferred closing school decisions,
That's right.
all these things, because it's not politically possible. It's not politically sexy to have that conversation. No one wants to be the board member that brings it up. But now we've been in a strike for 10 days. Students have lost, 10 days of learning at this point. After, like you said, Heather, we're in school year 3 of this pandemic impacting learning, right? Like this is the cost of not being a financially healthy district at this moment, right? And so we can't also jeopardize that going into the future. And so that is the tension, and that is what's keeping us out of school. And like we're going to continue to be out of school until they figure that out. And that, like you said, Heather, has real implications as well in terms of making up the minimum amount of hours for Minneapolis Public Schools to get their funding and all of that kind of stuff. So it is a real challenge.
Yep. It's a challenge, and I think it's the thing that's hardest about it is that the most marginalized students are continuing to feel the biggest impact. It's a pattern that we've shown that we're willing to consistently to do that. And so, well, we'll continue to watch and update you as best we can as counter proposals and proposals come out. We are watching, and we are so hopeful that we can get to a place where our students can get back in school soon, and that the people who are going to be in front of them will feel like this was worth it for them.
And they feel appreciated and valued, because they definitely deserve to be. So
that is absolutely right. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Well, thank you all for listening. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Bye.